Why don't we get started? Now, this will be our last discussion with respect to the Great Migration. I need to know if you have any questions from our last discussion. The black restaurants, the women that we talked about that really made a mark for themselves, with the cosmetologist creator, Madame C.J. Walker, being noted as the first African-American millionaire in the history of this country. Any questions? All right, well, why don't we move ahead then? Now, slavery existed in New York Territory until 1827. And shortly after slavery was abolished in New York Territory and other northern areas, African Americans, many with skills acquired while enslaved, after they were free, they began to experience the business world in the North as freedmen, well in advance of the Great Migration, were able to apply their skills when allowed by law. For example, many of the skills areas in terms of vocation, in terms of work itself, all of that was done by slaves. Catering, restauranting, barbering rather. I'm not sure about cosmetology, but certainly barbering. Many skills, artisan skills, building houses, thatching roofs, and things of that nature, were all done by slaves. So, as a matter of fact, some of the buildings that you see erected today throughout the country were erected as a result of slave labor. So when emancipation came to the North, especially, blacks in those situations as slaves, when freed, were given the opportunity in most areas to begin their own businesses should they wish. But in some instances where a slave owner had a heart, after emancipation came by law, and they knew that their slaves were involved in that kind of work, slowly gave the business over to them as they grew older. So that by, let's say, 1870, 1880, 20 years after emancipation, roughly, we had black people engaged in all kinds of things. But that would end with the European immigration, because Europeans coming into the country having the same skills and more began to replace blacks in those particular positions. Now, when we look at the sustenance, and all of this had that. They were sustained, and much of this was the result of the strong presence and success of Booker T. Washington, himself a former slave. And in 1900, Washington established the National Negro Business League. The national meaning, of course, that it was spread throughout the country. It was started in the North, in Boston, in the year 1900. And these leagues were formed to superintend the interest, the implementation, and the perpetuation of black-owned businesses. Booker T. Washington, if you don't know it, was the most powerful black person in America until his death in 1915. And even today, his presence resonates, especially throughout the Black South. But he was very favorable to white men of power, including George Eastman. They gave thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to Washington because Washington encouraged non-political activity among blacks. He encouraged a certain level of docility among blacks. He encouraged black people not to go to the north, but to stay in the south, which southern white labor enjoyed. And so with some of that money, he started this league. Now this league was set up to provide seed money to any black person with a business skill. The only thing they had to do was to submit what we call today, I guess, some kind of form, a proposal, some kind of grant, and generally it would be accepted. It usually ran about $5,000 to get things started, no matter what it was. Now this would also extend itself to huge major corporations such as hospitals that we talked about. I want to know where the black hospitals came from. Most of them came from the seed money gotten from Washington's group. Now, there was one exception. Well, I should say there was one stipulation, that all of these people getting this grant money from Washington's Business League had to agree to, that they would adopt and promote and advocate Booker Washington's social philosophy of non-political involvement on the part of black people. Now this was swell if you look at it from the standpoint of getting businesses started, but it was not that good from the standpoint of black leadership that understood the necessity for black people to vote. So that's why Washington got all of this money, because he got it from white men, industrialists, I mean the top men in the world who were living in America, he got money from. So much so that he built two institutions. Hampton University, which is today probably #1 or #2 among the black colleges in the United States, and #5 in the east of all schools, including Ivy League schools. It's hard to get into Hampton. It takes about 3 years, so most parents put them on a waiting list, but as soon as they're able to go someplace else, they go. And Tuskegee. Most of you have heard of Tuskegee. Tuskegee was a great veterinarian school, and at one time was 12th in the United States in terms of that form of medicine. The other aspect of all of this was that these two institutions have maintained themselves, have grown very, very strong, and both are racially integrated at this point, although they are still identified as black schools. Yes?
Why would he not want African Americans to get involved politically?
Because it was a power play on his part. He knew if he advocated that from the standpoint of social strength, then he would fall into favor of these white men of power. Had he not done it, he wouldn't have gotten a dime. And that was the stipulation. We'll give you this if you do this. That's the stipulation today. If any of you work for any agency at any time, and you see them writing these proposals as grants, that's why most major groups have grants writers, like the University of Rochester. It's all stipulative. I'll give you, yes, we'll donate $500,000 to your project on campus, but we must insist that this be done. And if you don't do it, you don't get the money. So it's always a compromise with respect to that in most instances. Now there are some private grants that don't ask that. They only ask that there's some grants, for example, that only give money to social programs programs that take the position of advocating strongly for social and human justice. That's the only thing they won't give money to the U of R, and let's say it's a project that deals with that. And that's one such example would be the Kellogg Foundation, which is the same foundation. It's named after the Kellogg family, the cereal magnate. And there's the Ralston family. It's Quaker, and they were very strongly involved in anti-slavery abolitionism. And even to this day, they project millions of dollars for what they call civil rights activity. So some do not require anything more than just a verbal commitment that this money will be used in this way, while others really do require looking at statistics and other things to see what you have done. That's why when you want to most firms will reapply for an extension of that grant, but only if some assessment is made to make certain that that group or that company or that institution is following the guidelines set for it to receive the initial money. So what Washington was doing was new in the sense of timeliness, but it wasn't anything that was unique, simply because what Washington did was what most organizations were either doing or would do in the future. I think the first of these, in terms of Congress, was the Land Grant Act. The Land Grant Act provided free territory, geography, land for educational institutions that were like agricultural and mechanical schools. You see, like Texas A&M, Prairie View A&M, or schools that originally started out that way. Most colleges did. They started out because the college system really didn't take off in this country until after the Civil War. And that's when the Land Grant Act was passed by Congress, donating all of this land to whomever would apply for it. The land was wide open. Some areas, other than Native Americans, the land was wide open. Since Native Americans weren't considered as being human beings, but savages, get them out the best way you can and establish the great manifest destiny. So even though this country advanced by way of civilization and progress, it took a lot of human lives in the process. But let's move on. Now, these national business leagues were very important. It created, as an adjunct to its organization, another organization called the National Negro Bankers Association. And as early as 1911, it reported that there were 62 banks in the United States under the management and ownership, excuse me, my phone's unusually, it doesn't happen too much. I'll call them later. 1911, it reported 62 banks. Note this now. There were 62 banks in 1911 in the United States under the management and ownership of African Americans. Now, before the fall of Wall Street in 1929, that ushered in the Great Depression, that number would swell to an unbelievable 83. And even though the majority of these banks were in the South, as a result of the black migration, many of them were expanded into northern cities and were to produce several outstanding black bankers. And perhaps in history, the black man foremost known for this was Jesse Binga, B-I-N-G-A, Jesse Binga of Chicago. Now, I know what you're asking. Good heavens, 83 banks, what happened? Well, today, the year 2017, there are only 6. Only 6 banks in the United States that are owned and managed professionally by blacks. Most of them collapsed as a result of the Great Migration. Some of them were savings and loans banks, which meant that they were automatically cut down during that period of time. But a few have survived, and several of them went under during World War II. So now we have six banks. There was an attempt 30 years ago, in the 1980s, to develop in this city a black bank, and you had to apply to, there was whoever superintends this thing now, but it failed simply because they had to have seed money and they didn't have enough. And since they had no national business, Negro Business League representative, they didn't get it. And so the hopes and dreams of a black bank for Rochester bit the dust. But that's what happened to them. Now, of all the support provided, people coming in as a result of the migration from the south to the north, it would remain the black religious organizations, including the Islamic ones, fraternal, professional, and business organizations, and the struggles and dedication of black physicians that were to save African Americans between 1910 and 1920 from complete destitution and mental hygiene collapse. Remember now, we had no mental health agencies. So most people had to depend upon other institutions to provide mental therapy, and that term wasn't known then, I'm sure, but in that sense, that kind of support. After 1920, with the racial reordering of public schools, educational advancement was strong after 1920. Now, though they found themselves encircled by social segregation and Jim Crow laws, because laws in the North, even though the North was a better place to live, they were still racially restricted, so blacks could only assume certain things. When I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, schools were still segregated. There were certain movies that we could not go to, couldn't eat in any restaurant, could book no rooms in any hotels, and this was up through the 1950s. So after many of the gains for black people in my home city didn't occur until after the passage of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. And as late as 1970, they were still arguing, putting in lawsuits for desegregation of schools in Ohio. Columbus was all set, but some of the rural areas, like the rural areas we have around here, where the schools were separated and blacks were not permitted entree into them. And you would find no black doctors in hospitals. Hospitals had a position of admitting black patients. That only changed during the war, World War II. And there was a time where the Red Cross would not accept black blood. They'd take it and they'd dump it until found out. You talk to black veterans today from World War II, they have a deep bitterness toward the Red Cross for what they did. They would give white soldiers donuts, would give the black soldiers anything. Terrible, terrible situation. Yes, it seems like the times were better. Maybe so for some people in some areas. Families, for example, black people certainly did take advantage of their own institutions, and their families were stronger. But other than that, the racism was just everywhere. Look at some of the movies now from the 1940s and the 1950s. Only blacks you see are porters, or shoeshine boys, or maids. Nobody with any responsibility at all. Yes?
Why would they take the blood and then dump it? Why wouldn't they just turn them away? Or, like, were they giving black soldiers white blood?
No, there were, no, that's the problem. When the war started, the federal government mandated that blood from all people should be gotten.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to comply to that, but they would take the blood, in most instances, they would take the blood and destroy the blood after given, so that the quantity of blood would not increase very much. And it's very ironic that the system, the battlefield system that saved many, many, many lives of soldiers, plasma, blood plasma,
Mm-hmm.
that was created by a black man, Dr. Charles Drew. And even he died on the highway. He bled to death because he was in an automobile accident in North Carolina, and the hospital refused to accept him because he was black. So he died on the highway. The same man who created this transfusion process that would save I guess it saved millions of lives up to now, but during the war it saved thousands of lives because it was a new process, but it was certainly one where they could actually provide blood on the site of battle and save lives. This we didn't have at all during World War I, and during World War I you had the use of gas. That was the most lethal, horrible death that you can imagine. Soldiers being gassed. That's why you see a lot of old combat films. All the guys have on gas masks. A lot of the guys have gas masks. But that's what led to the League of Nations outlawing the use of gas on any human being. Although it wasn't followed because when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, one of their major implements was the use of poison gas. But that's a horrible death. I was in a veterans hospital for a while, and they still had guys from World War I in there. And you'd hear them over there screaming. They're old men, but they'd be screaming because they were victims of gas, and that's all they did. You couldn't, boom, gone. That's another thing that happens. If you don't die, it will destroy all your brain cells and all that stuff. But that's why they tried to outlaw it. During World War II, there was no use of poison gas at all because it was too deeply embedded, I think, in the minds of everyone how bad it would be. And even a man as unbalanced as Adolf Hitler, even Hitler indicated there would be no use of gas from his commanders in any battle. So, but that's a rough.
Not
yeah.
battle, but they use.
Are we
Yeah,
talking-
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because he ended up using gas on, like, the
gas
or
chambers.
the gas
Oh,
chambers.
yeah, no, yeah, what happened a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, no, we're talking about, well, yeah, also Syria, but we were talking about, in the concentration camps.
Oh, that's, yeah.
But that wasn't like
oh,
battle,
yes.
that was-
Yes, that,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
I was speaking of combat.
Yeah.
Yes, it definitely. They gassed millions of Jewish people, including children. Yes, they did. They had gas ducts built into the shower system, and at times they would tell people to get undressed, line up, you're going to take a shower, and tell them lies, and they would line up being very hopeful, and instead of water coming out of those, whatever you call those things, poison gas, only take a few minutes, everybody be gone, it's in there. That's horrible. Yeah, the death camps are full of that and burning people to death and shooting people. Jews, homosexuals, communists, gypsies, and although you don't see anything about it, they killed 25,000 black people. Soldiers who were captured, pilots who were shot down, and black people who had made their homes in Europe, descendants of men from World War I, and also African troops who were fighting with the Allies, such as the Senegalese troops who fought with the French because Senegal was a colonial possession of France. But it was terrible. I have a book that details that racial statistics and other statistics which would put the head count among persons actually killed by Hitler in concentration camps at about 12 or 13 million, with about close to 7 million Jewish people, because with the Jews, and you take this figure, what is not built into those statistics for the most part are Jewish children, only Jewish adults. So that would raise that figure significantly to nearly 7 million, certainly at least 6.5 million. So that's man's inhumanity to man. And I say men because it was men who projected all of these evils. That's why I wanted Hillary Clinton. I voted for her after Bernie Sanders was nominated, after he lost the nomination. I voted for Hillary Clinton because she was a woman. I'm going to be very frank with you. Not so much because of her programs, that her programs were more hopeful than Mr. Trump's, but because you see, women have a, and I don't see anything but women in this class, you know. But I'd say this if we're all men. You see, I want you to stay a woman. I don't want you to act like a man. Why? Because women have a particular point of view that's more humane. Because women become mothers, men don't. So the humane element is with women more so than with men. So I think that from time to time it's necessary to have a female perspective, point of view. Yeah, you can have some women that are crazy, but for the most part that's not the case. So whatever level of oppression you go to, just be like a black person. Take that oppression, turn it inward, and make it self-determination. You hear me? Y'all hear me?
Yes.
Don't get married to anybody that's a brute. You marry somebody that's good and kind, so your children will be good and kind. Because parental genes are what develops the minds of children. Remember that. Remember that now. Remember that. I told it to you. Remember it. All right. Be sure. Now, if your father wants to give the young man you bring home to introduce to your parents as your first husband, your father is going to give him the 3rd degree. My daughter called me 2 weeks ago to wish me a happy Easter. One of my daughters who lives in Albany, and she had the nerve to tell me that she is engaged. I said, what? Well, she should have been married years back, you know, but I said, and she wants me to, I said, all right, sure, that we can do that. We can work that out. So they'll be here next week. But nonetheless, I said, does he wear earrings? Does he wear pump shoes? Does he have tattoos? And he, I don't know what your political persuasion is, but I said, and he better not be a Republican. And silence. Silence. Silence on the other end. So I'll meet the guy. I'll see what he's made of. But, so I'm just saying that your dad's going to give him the 1-2. He's going to give him look up and down, questions and answers. So, but that's, if your father didn't do it, something's wrong. Or if he doesn't do it, something's wrong. All right, let's move on. All right? All right. Now, as I said, though they found themselves, black people, encircled by social segregation and Jim Crow laws in the North, black people developed enough mobility and determination to take advantage of situations through the creation of their own, and this is one of the points of survival, they developed their own independent institutions. They were modeled by Europeanism, but the theater, the restaurant, all of these things, even schools, certainly churches, and other religious institutions, black people just simply created their own. And through the encapsulation of their culture, their heritage, and African American values, particularly as these related to the family, the stabilization of the family, and the unity of the family. So when I look at the black family today, I'm very puzzled at its decomposition, its lack of stability among poor people, when the strength of the family was found at one point in families that were impoverished. And I think the major reason, without this is not a class on contemporary sociology, but one of the major reasons is most children, such as myself, grew up with two parents in the home, active grandparents. So there's no such thing as a babysitter. That's new. Latchkey children, that's new. So all of the, and it all points to, and the war had something to do with it, I suppose, because people start leaving homes, moving into apartments, and certainly when you move to apartments, it's too small for your parents to come in. So we used to live with parents and grandparents, same building, same structure. So at all times you had that protection, you had that security, and a lot of the things that parents worry about now, simply non-existent to a heavy degree as recently as 40, 50 years ago. But now things are much, much different. Even marriage has changed. I spoke of you getting married, but even marriage has changed. A lot of my high school buddies married their high school sweethearts. And what amazes me is when I go home now, they're still holding hands. It's in those days you got married early. You had options. If you were a young man graduating from high school, you had three glaring options: military, college, or work. You could make a choice. Look, unemployment, pretty much, if you wanted to work, you found a job. Jobs are everywhere. And a lot of the guys who decided not to go to the military, not to go into the not to go to school, further schooling, usually got married. And they were married at 19, 18, 19, 20, and their wife was either the same age or a year younger, a year or two younger, and that's the way it was. And they grew up as young parents. And if you're going to have children, it's best to have them early on, so you can grow up with them, so you won't be 90 years old and your child be 30. You want to be able to be energetic enough to keep up with your children. Believe me, I told you, my wife and I adopted 2 children 10 years ago. Whew, boy. I used to hear grandparents say, "Oh, I love my grandchildren so much. I just love them when they drop them off at the weekend, but I can't wait until Sunday when they're going to pick them up." But little children are just energetic. I've forgotten all about the terrible 2s. Now it's the terrible 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's expanded way beyond control. But they are, and that's another thing. They are the ones that are in control. The little ones, if you love them, they're in control. You say, "No, you can't do that. No, I'm not going to get you that." You know what you're going to do. You're going to end up doing it or getting it. My last biological children, and then I'll get to you, Miss Martin, they worked out a deal. You know what they did? They said, "Tell Daddy he promised us to do this at such a time." And then one day I was reading the paper, and sure enough, she came up to me and she said, "Daddy, Do you remember, that's the thing, that's always, do you remember? Do you remember when you were reading the paper and drinking coffee, we asked you to take us to the zoo, and you said yes? And then I said, now wait a minute now, when I read the paper, I'm reading the sports page, when I'm drinking coffee, I don't like to be disturbed. And I said, go away, go away. And I said, now, maybe I did tell them that. So I got in the car, then it dawned on me, halfway to the zoo, I've been had. Too late then. But that's the way kids are. And you love them then.
We got you figured out.
But it's hard to say no, it really is, especially when they're growing up. You want them to have all that they can have, because it's good for their development, their social development. All right, let's move on, because we want to finish this today. Now, whatever our distinctive or unique African American values prove not only crucial to black solidarity and survival, but also prove to be the very best defense against racist and demeaning insensitivity. Now, this security, regardless of its lack of permanency, meaning that it would, over time, not be there, but it permitted black people the opportunity of developing their own leadership criteria. For by the time the Great Migration would begin in earnest, let's say around 1915 or so, there would be no black person anywhere known who could be lifted up as the great advocate for them. Booker Washington was dead. Marcus Garvey was on the ship. And unfortunately, very few black people in the United States understood the message of W.E.B. Du Bois. He was perhaps a primary intellectual among black people, prime intellectual throughout the world known, and his language was so high that, and he was saying the very same things that, let's say, Booker Washington was saying, but they said it out of a different context. And the majority of the black community could not understand the message of Du Bois, who also was a Marxist, so that many of the things that he would stipulate could not, at least at that point in time in history, be grasped. Now, if we look down at the end of the Great Migration now, it has drawn interest of late. Of late, some scholars are paying attention to it, especially with the situation that exists in most major northern cities today. But among the best studies of this epic, and you can write these down, these are works that I would recommend on the Great Migration. But some of the best works are those which were written in the years immediately following these journeys. And I think here we'd have to have the Negro migration during the World War, the Negro migration during the World War. That's written by Emmett Scott. A very similar title, and really the very same time period, is the Negro migration of 1916-1918. The Negro migration of 1916-1918, written by H.H. Donald, as in Trump, H.H. Donald. Now, the latter book is published master's thesis from Yale University, the work by Donald. Then we have 2 volumes, classic works in my opinion, that deal primarily with the city of Chicago and how it would respond to the Great Migration. Written by Saint S.T. St. Clair, C-L-A-I-R, St. Clair Drake, and Horace Cayton, Cayton. And it's in 2 volumes called The Black Metropolis, a study of Negro life in a northern city. It was first written in 1945, but it really didn't take fire until its revision in 1961. And it chronicles segments of the Great Migration impact upon Chicago. Now, a much later full and concise study of this movement has been written by a man named James Grossman. And his book is called Land of Hope and subtitled Chicago, Black Southerners, and the Great Migration, obviously concentrating on Chicago. As we said the other day, at the height of the Great Migration, the highest number of people were not in New York City, but in Chicago. What heightened the New York State number of blacks during that period were the influx of Afro-Caribbeans. Now, the work by Grossman was done in 1984, but that wasn't the latest major work. Strongly recognized, as well as recommended, is a book written by Isabel Wilkerson. Isabel Wilkerson. She has written a superb work on the Great Migration. It dates from 2011. 2011. It's titled The Warmth of Other Suns, and subtitled, that's S-U-N-S, This Epic Story of the Great Migration. The Warmth of Other Suns. The epic stories. A lot of pages in this. If you want to sit down and read it, you can't read it overnight. The epic story of the Great Migration. Now, she has also written, I just read this about 2 or 3 months ago, but she, Miss Wilkerson, also written a very emotional essay on the subject, The Road to, and it's called The Road to Freedom. And it's printed in the September 2016 issue of the Smithsonian Institution magazine. It's called Institution here, the book. The Smithsonian Institution magazine. Anybody here subscribe to that? That's large. Okay, so something you might want to subscribe to. Now, as we close our talk on the Great Migration, there's some things I have not talked about that were very important, such as the athletic, the artistic, the entertainment, and the intellectual talents exhibited by young black people of the Great Migration. I'll do this in other classes. Now, of importance, though the actual data, we don't have it, is not known, and this would be a great research, I think, for somebody. But of importance is the social impact that black veterans who would transplant to the North following World War I would have. It's another story. Many black veterans who were from the South, after going to Europe and finding the population, the European population, more welcome to them, they changed them, had a profound effect on them, changed them rather dramatically, so that they refused to return to the South and would either stay in Europe or go back to Europe, or would move to the northern communities. But there would be an impact on that. I haven't studied it. There should be some statistics somewhere with respect to it. I might go back, way back to Scott's book, which was written in 1919 on the black migration and World War I, but I have that book, but but it's somebody who's young. You know you're going to get up in the morning. Should do that. All right. Now, that's all the Great Migration. We talked about immigration, then we talked about the internal movement which was the Great Migration. The only thing that comes next would be the exodusters. That's the movement of white poor from Oklahoma and Texas west, Oregon, Washington State, and California. But that's a big story in itself. It's separate, but it's big. The drama is yet there, though. Family removal, family displacement, and a lot of problems. Not only where they came from, but where they would go. Any questions at all? Got to be one. Well, you did ask several during the course, class, this class, today. So do you have any more? Now, if I were to ask you, could you give me just working knowledge of what your Great Migration was? You could do that, right? All right. Now, you know the dates. Well, social historians are kind of not quite together, but they're together enough. I dated 1914. That's when it really started, 1914 to 1920. After that, there would be a steady movement, but really low in numbers. There was we could call it World War II. The wars had a lot to do with these things because people follow work wherever you can get work. World War II, we saw a lot of misplacement, I should say displacement on the part of black people from Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, going to California to work in the shipyards. That was very inviting, a lot of money. San Diego, San Francisco, other places. I don't think LA was. Oh, Riverside, California, a lot of places. There's also a lot of migrant work there. Oh, do you know this? I bet you don't know this. I have to have something, mention something that you don't know about. And that is that at one time, California had the greatest harvest of cotton in the United States. You didn't know that, did you? All right. I'm going to see everybody shake your head no. You didn't know that, did you? Good, good. That's something you don't know. California. California was the last state to abolish slavery, 1872. Slavery didn't come to California until 1849 with the gold rush. A lot of Southerners were a part of that who had slaves, and their slaves were with them. So it took California about 23 years after that to take the notion to abandon that process, which they did. I think 1920 would be about the year to end the Great Migration. Most of it, and because of the impact that the Great Migration would have on the Harlem Renaissance, that's when you have the intellectuality coming forth. Poets, writers, musicians. The greatest of the blues singers would head to Chicago, or New York, Kansas City, the Delta, the Southern Delta. In Miss Wilkerson's article on the long trail, I think, the Freedom Trail, on the Freedom Trail, the Road to Freedom, she has a section in that. It's a pretty good article. It's about 6 or 7 pages long, but it's great reading. But she talks about the number of outstanding musicians, Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, others, whose parents were part of the Great Migration, and they were born in the mid-20s and would have come to be known as some of the greatest artists, musicians, singers in the world, international acclaim. John Coltrane, it's just amazing. Their parents moving from the south to the north, and that's where they gave birth to them. But let's read that. Let's do some reading other than what you're doing. I know we don't have much time for reading. But any questions now? All right, now what we're going to talk about, we've gone through the phases. What we're going to talk about next, we're going to keep our heads with respect to the title, and we're going to talk about poverty, its encroachment within communities, the problems that are related directly to poverty, the problems that are related to poverty, and its resolution, which there is no resolution at this point. Monroe County put together anti-poverty initiative it's about 3, maybe 4 years old now. At least it was realistic. They said that it would eliminate poverty by 50% within 15 years. That's doable. But nothing has occurred yet. Nothing. As a matter of fact, if anything, poverty cycle has grown. You have babies still being born. As long as you have babies born into any kind of situation, that cycle is not going to stop. No way. Poor babies become poor people. So that goes on and on. We don't talk about poverty because its ramifications are telling.